Over the years, numerous countries have voiced significant dissatisfaction with the United Nations, occasionally suggesting they might withdraw. However, no member state has ever fully and formally departed from the organization. One notable historical instance occurred in 1965, when Indonesia announced its exit in response to Malaysia's election as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. Despite Jakarta's proclamation of withdrawal, the UN never officially recognized it, and Indonesia rejoined the following year under a new government, making the departure a temporary break rather than a permanent exit. In recent years, other nations have expressed similar frustrations. In 2016, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte threatened to leave the UN after the organization criticized his administration's anti-drug operations, accusing the UN of interfering in the Philippines' sovereign affairs. Despite his harsh rhetoric, the Philippines remained a member, illustrating the challenge of following through on such threats. Occasionally, there have been discussions in the United States about withdrawing from the UN, often driven by isolationist or unilateralist political factions. For example, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act of 2017 sought to end U.S. membership, gaining some attention but ultimately failing due to concerns over diplomatic consequences, the U.S.'s established role in multilateralism, and the broad acknowledgement of the UN's significance in global governance. Countries in the Global South, especially those in the BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have increasingly called for comprehensive UN reforms. These nations represent over 40% of the global population and nearly a quarter of the world's GDP, a share that continues to grow. Yet the UN's power structures, particularly the Security Council, still reflect a mid-20th century framework. The 5 permanent members with veto power, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, continue to dominate the Council's agenda, influencing decisions on peacekeeping, sanctions, and global security. Despite Africa's 54 member states, which account for nearly 28% of UN membership, they still have no permanent seat on the Council. Many observers from the Global South and BRICS nations criticize what they perceive as ingrained Western biases in global governance, media framing, and the enforcement of human rights norms. They argue that criticism and sanctions are disproportionately directed at countries outside the Western sphere, while similar or more severe abuses by Western nations or their allies often go unchallenged. A key aspect of this critique is the uneven oversight of human rights. For instance, Russia's laws restricting LGBTQ+ rights and China's treatment of minority groups, such as Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Tibetans, and Mongolian communities, are widely condemned in Western media and diplomatic forums. These criticisms are supported by reports from the UN Human Rights Council, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch, which document arbitrary detentions, forced labor, and severe restrictions on cultural and religious practices. At the same time, critics argue that human rights violations in Western countries often receive less sustained global attention. Issues like systemic racism, racial profiling, and police brutality, highlighted by movements such as Black Lives Matter in the US, have sparked domestic protests and condemnation, but they rarely lead to comparable international pressure or sanctions. Similarly, indigenous communities in the US, Canada, and Australia have long faced discrimination, economic hardship, and cultural suppression, including the notorious legacy of residential schools in Canada and inadequate services on Native American reservations. Although international organizations produce reports on these issues, the diplomatic pushback and media coverage they generate are generally much less pronounced than the scrutiny directed at non-Western governments. Media influence also plays a role in shaping perceptions of double standards. Dominant Western outlets often focus on human rights abuses by geopolitical rivals such as Russia and China, ensuring that these issues remain in the global spotlight. In the Western world, human rights shortcomings are often downplayed or framed as unintended failures, rather than systemic issues resulting from deliberate policies. This significant imbalance in the portrayal of human rights problems not only skews public perception, but also influences the priorities of institutions like the UN Human Rights Council and the European Court of Human Rights. These disparities in coverage mold public sentiment, shaping which issues receive attention and which are relegated to the background. For instance, when examining human rights violations, the West frequently highlights abuses in other regions while minimizing or overlooking its own shortcomings. This selective focus on specific issues influences how global organizations prioritize their responses. In effect, Western nations' own human rights flaws are either downplayed or presented as isolated incidents, rather than as reflections of larger, more ingrained patterns of inequality. A glaring example of this imbalance can be seen in the different responses to refugees and asylum seekers across the globe, particularly in Europe. The disparity in how the European Union (EU) treated refugees from Ukraine as opposed to those fleeing conflicts in the Middle East and Africa offers a striking illustration. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the EU swiftly enacted its rarely used Temporary Protection Directive, which granted about 8 million Ukrainians immediate access to work, education, healthcare, and the freedom to move across EU member states. This generous treatment was in stark contrast to the prolonged and often bureaucratically difficult asylum processes faced by refugees from countries like Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia, particularly during the 2015 migrant crisis. During the 2015 influx of refugees, many European nations erected border barriers, engaged in pushbacks at sea, and entered into controversial arrangements, like the EU-Turkey deal, aimed at reducing arrivals from the Middle East and North Africa. These measures often left refugees stranded in overcrowded camps in places like Lesbos, or trapped in transit countries such as Libya and Turkey, where they faced inadequate services and frequent human rights violations. These harsh restrictions were often justified on the grounds of security concerns and immigration control, arguments that were not similarly applied to Ukrainians. Critics argue that the EU's welcoming stance toward Ukrainian refugees exposes deep-rooted cultural, racial, and religious biases. Ukrainians, who are largely white, Christian, and European, are seen as more culturally familiar, making them less likely to encounter skepticism or discrimination. In contrast, refugees from countries like Syria, Afghanistan, or Somalia, who are predominantly Muslim, speak different languages, and follow non-European traditions, often face heightened scrutiny, stigma, and bureaucratic hurdles. Research from organizations like the Refugee Council and the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, ECRE, has highlighted discriminatory practices against non-European refugees, including slower asylum processes, lower acceptance rates, and restricted access to language classes and job opportunities. Some European policymakers defend the rapid support given to Ukrainians by arguing that it was a result of the proximity of the conflict, the clear aggression of Russia, and the logistical ease of providing assistance to European neighbors. However, critics counter that similar urgency was not shown for refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, or Somalia, despite the dire circumstances they were fleeing. For example, while Ukrainian refugees were granted swift access to the EU's support systems, Syrians fleeing the devastation of Aleppo, Afghans escaping Taliban rule, and Somalis enduring long-standing crises received far less assistance. The European Parliament's own findings suggest that the special measures enacted for Ukrainians were not extended to other refugee groups during previous humanitarian disasters, exposing a pattern of selective compassion. From this perspective, Europe's tiered refugee response contradicts its stated ideals of equality, human rights, and universal protection. By applying favorable rules for some groups and restrictive measures for others, the EU signals that cultural, racial, or religious affinities may outweigh the principle of equal protection for all people fleeing danger. This selective approach not only undermines the EU's moral credibility, but also shapes global perceptions of the West's commitment to human rights and equality. As conflicts, climate change, and economic pressures continue to drive migration from the global South, the debate over these double standards is likely to intensify. It calls on Europe and the international community to reconcile their proclaimed humanitarian values with their uneven application. The growing scrutiny on these disparities will undoubtedly shape the future of refugee policy and international human rights discourse, urging a more consistent and equitable approach to the protection of vulnerable populations across the globe. Let's take a moment to pause for a quick reminder. If you've been enjoying the video so far, we kindly ask for a small favor. It would mean the world to us if you could hit that like button. Not only does it help us, but it also plays a big role in helping us reach a broader audience and share our message with even more people. And if you feel like sharing your thoughts, feedback, or even questions in the comments, it can have an even greater impact. Your engagement really helps us improve and continue delivering content that matters. Thank you for your support and for watching. Now let's dive back into the discussion. The issue of underrepresentation within global financial institutions is one that has persisted for many years, and it remains a point of contention for BRICS nations. For decades, these emerging economies have expressed frustration over their limited influence in key international financial organizations that were established and led primarily by Western powers after World War II. Despite the fact that the BRICS countries together contribute about a quarter of the world's GDP and represent a significant share of global trade and investment, they hold a disproportionately small amount of power in institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. At the heart of the problem is the system of quotas at the IMF, which not only determines the financial contributions each member country must make, but also directly impacts their voting power. Despite various reforms over the years, Western nations, particularly the United States and the European Union, continue to dominate these institutions. As of the early 2020s, these Western-aligned countries still control over 60% of the voting shares at the IMF, a number that has remained largely unchanged despite calls for reform. In fact, the United States alone retains more than 16% of the voting power, effectively giving it veto power over key decisions that require an 85% majority. In stark contrast, China, whose economy surpassed $18 trillion in 2020, holds less than 7% of the vote, a number that is glaringly disproportionate to its economic stature. The historical imbalances in voting power are a direct result of the post-World War II framework that was created in a very different economic context. This framework, which remains largely intact today, fails to reflect the rapid changes in the global economy. While incremental reforms have been made, such as the IMF's 2010 quota changes that took effect in 2016, these adjustments have been modest at best. China's voting share at the IMF did rise slightly, but it still falls far short of what would be considered a fair reflection of its global economic role. India, which is on the verge of becoming the third largest economy in the world, continues to hold a voting share that is far below its economic output and population size. Similarly, countries like Brazil and South Africa face the same discrepancies, with their influence at these institutions tied to a bygone era, rather than their current roles as regional economic and political leaders. Another point of frustration for BRICS nations is the long-standing tradition of Western dominance in leadership positions at the IMF and the World Bank. Since the Bretton Woods Agreement, it has been an unwritten rule that an American citizen leads the World Bank and a European heads the IMF. Despite repeated calls from emerging market nations for a more merit-based and transparent process for leadership selection, one that could potentially favor candidates from the developing world, no substantial departures from this tradition have taken place. This lack of change has only reinforced perceptions that these institutions continue to serve the priorities of the West, rather than being truly global in their governance. The implications of this underrepresentation are not just theoretical or political, they have real-world consequences. The IMF's loan conditions, which often come with structural adjustment programs, are frequently criticized for promoting fiscal austerity measures and rapid liberalization. These policies, which are rooted in Western economic thinking, are not always well suited to the developmental needs of countries in the global South. Similarly, the World Bank's lending priorities have sometimes been skewed, leading to projects that fail to adequately consider local perspectives or prioritize sustainable, inclusive growth. This has created a perception that these financial institutions, while powerful, are not necessarily working in the best interests of emerging markets. In response to these long-standing grievances, the BRICS nations have increasingly pushed for recalibrations to global financial governance. They have used forums like the G20 and their own BRICS summits to advocate for changes in IMF quotas that would better reflect the shifting economic realities of the world. These countries are also calling for a louder voice for the global South in shaping international financial policies. As part of this push for greater equity, the BRICS launched the New Development Bank, NDB, in 2014, a move designed to offer an alternative source of financing that better aligns with the priorities of emerging markets. Other financial institutions, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, are similarly working to diversify global financial power. While the NDB and AIIB represent a significant shift in global financing, their rise also highlights how slow and resistant the traditional international financial institutions have been to accommodate the growing economic power of non-Western countries. The question of reform is not lost on all Western policymakers. Some have acknowledged that a more equitable governance structure at the IMF and World Bank could improve their legitimacy and effectiveness, but progress has been slow. Political resistance and institutional inertia remain significant barriers to any bold reforms. Without substantial change, critics warn that these institutions risk becoming irrelevant in an increasingly multipolar world, where emerging markets like China and India continue to expand their influence. As these economies grow in importance, the demands for a more balanced distribution of power and a more inclusive approach to global financial governance will only intensify. Geopolitical tensions further amplify these frustrations. For instance, Russia, which has been isolated by Western sanctions following its 2022 invasion of Ukraine, is increasingly relying on the BRICS group for economic and diplomatic support. China's assertive stance on issues like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and the South China Sea has deepened the divides between the BRICS countries and the West, reinforcing their shared interest in challenging the perceived dominance of Western-led institutions. Beyond politics, the BRICS nations also have shared concerns in areas like climate change and trade. They argue that Western-led climate initiatives often impose ambitious emissions reduction targets on developing nations that are still working to build their industrial base. Countries like India, for example, insist that fair climate action must also involve financial and technological support to help developing countries achieve sustainable growth without stifling their development. Similarly, the debate over agricultural subsidies in the US and EU continues to highlight policies that disadvantage farmers in the global south, exacerbating global inequalities. As the global landscape continues to shift, various reform proposals have gained traction. One potential reform involves expanding the United Nations Security Council to grant permanent seats to countries like India and Brazil, thereby reflecting the new geopolitical realities. Strengthening regional organizations, such as the African Union, could also help distribute authority more evenly across the globe. Emerging coalitions like BRICS+, which includes countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, represent a shift toward greater non-Western influence in global governance. As BRICS continues to expand its influence, the pressure for reform will only grow. If Western powers continue to resist meaningful changes, the BRICS countries and their growing network of partners may form parallel institutions to counter the existing Western-led frameworks. While internal differences persist among BRICS members, the direction of global governance may ultimately depend on whether these nations can unite behind a cohesive, effective push for a more balanced and representative international system. The stakes are high, and the potential for change is significant, but it will require cooperation, persistence, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. Thank you once again for watching this video. We truly appreciate your time and support. If you found our content interesting or thought-provoking, please consider showing your appreciation by liking and subscribing to our channel. Your support means a great deal to us, and it helps us continue bringing valuable content your way. Don't forget to check out another video from our channel, which is now on the screen.